Good morning.
Morning.
All right, we'll give it just another minute or two because we're short a few people. So.
Guys, I have a canine companion with me for this class. Skylar! Baby, come here. She's sniffing the trash can. She does not want to come.
Aw.
Hello, people.
Oh, hi, puppy.
Baby.
Oh.
Oh, hi, baby.
She says, hi, my name is Skylar. I'm to stay calm because I have happy tail and I don't want to ruin everything. Happy tail is basically where the end of their tail has a recurring wound, and if they hit it against something, it'll start splatting blood everywhere.
Oh.
So while I want her to be happy, I do not want her to get blood all over my manager's office.
Oh, and it looks like a massacre has happened, and it is kind of traumatic if you've never seen it before.
I can imagine.
We have to put like big comforters over the sides of her kennel whenever she has like a flare up, because it will be awful and get blood on the dogs on the next kennels, and it's just a mess.
Well, do what you need to do to keep Skylar and yourself good to go.
We're good. She just needs socialization, so she's hanging out with me.
Awesome. Oh,
I have this one. Her name is Bella, and she's a Boston Terrier. And then I have this one is JoJo.
Oh, JoJo.
And Bella
Jeez.
and these are the goofballs that if they want any attention and I'm in class, they will shove themselves on the camera.
of course. This is like my favorite part of doing teaching remotely. Is
It's all the dogs.
everyone's dogs and cats. Yesterday we had, or not yesterday, Wednesday we had a faculty happy hour to talk about strategies for the rest of the semester. Hello, kitty. And Dr. Linvald doesn't have a pet, so he just has like a stuffed out to hold up when other people's pets come on screen. Alrighty. Well, I hope everybody's doing well. I hope the exam went okay. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I plan to grade it Sunday when I usually do my grading. If something horrible happens, it'll be the next week. But I put in your midterm progress reports. They obviously don't include the exam grades since I didn't do them yet. So take that into account if you're like freaking out when you see your score, because you know there's a lot more points for the rest of the semester. So that's an important piece of this. Speaking of the rest of the semester, since we're at the midway point, I thought I would screen share and go over the syllabus just so we make sure we're all on the same page here. Okay, so we are here. Da, 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 da. It's like the little arrow. So we're going to be doing trait theory today, which is interesting because it's kind of not a theory, which we'll explore as we talk about it. And then we will have some discussion about that next Wednesday. Then we'll do learning theory. Learning theory is probably my personal favorite just because I'm very trained in it. And you have some fun readings for that. And then we'll talk about, it sort of jams together evolutionary psych and ideas about behavioral genetics, which are kind of actually two different things. So we kind of do a whirlwind of that. And then, you know, in 3 weeks or so, I don't even know, it's crazy. You'll have exam 3. And on the day of exam 3, I will be assigning your roles for our reacting to the past simulation. And then that's what we'll do for the rest of the semester. So that should be really fun. And so probably, I don't know, somewhere around the end of October, I'll give you all a survey to fill out about the type of role you might be comfortable doing. So that's about, you know, if you'd be comfortable doing a role that doesn't agree with your opinion, if you've had like acting background and you feel comfortable taking on a giant role, if you'd rather have sort of a smaller role where you only have to make one speech. So we'll do that as we get to the end of the semester. And then for the last 3 weeks or so of the semester, we do that. And so you have a week of just prep time where we'll meet. The first day I kind of just explain the process. And then you have 2 days where you can like be doing research. And I'm available. And then we're going to start the simulation. And then we'll have a day to like regroup. And that day, the 20th, in theory, I'm attending a virtual conference, but they haven't actually put out the schedule yet. So I don't know if I'm going to have to miss class or not. But regardless, I'd be available over email. Then we have a whole week off for Thanksgiving, thank God, because I don't know about you all, but I'm like really burned out because we didn't have fall break. So I'm very excited. Yeah, it's exhausting. I understand why they did it, but I don't think it was the best decision they've ever made. And then we'll have another week of our simulation. And then if we need it to wrap up, we'll use the exam time. And if not, we'll just use that for some reflection on how things went. So the next part is very similar to what we've been doing. But then once we get to November and get past exam 3, it's a totally different ballgame. And I think a lot more fun, a lot more different. So, but yeah, so we're going to do traits, learning, and evolutionary/behavioral genetics for the next exam. So those are your 3 topics for the next exam.
I can't believe we're already halfway through the semester. That's just crazy.
I know.
It's crazy. It really is.
Reports were due until the registrar sent an email last week, and I was like, wait, it's halfway through the semester already? What? I like missed that my WGS class has an exam on Tuesday. I was just trucking ahead. One of them was like, Dr. Myers, today's supposed to be a review day. And I was like, right. We're going to review. Forget what I planned for today. I've already planned for next Thursday. It's just weird. It's really weird not having like that check-in constantly of, you know, seeing people in person and whatnot. All right, any questions about logistics for the rest of the semester? Life, the universe, and everything. I can only do so much with that. Alrighty, well, I will start diving into trait theory. I'm going to pause real quick, mute real quick while I pull up the PowerPoint because I almost have this sinus infection cleared out of my system, but I still have to blow a lot. So I don't want y'all have to listen to. I'm at that point where like my nose is raw because I've been blowing so much. It's lovely. Also, this is like random bit of self-indulgence, but I just love that the pandemic gave me like a full-on Stacey London gray streak. It's like one of my favorite things. I know some people are like, oh, I can't believe I'm getting gray hairs. I'm like, this is badass.
Dude, I want that too.
Yeah. One of my friends, I posted about it on Facebook, and one of my friends was like, oh, I've always wanted one. And I was like, well, I've been getting gray hair since I was 22, and this is the first time it's happened. So it could be coming for you too. Yeah,
I was gonna comment your hair looks really pretty today.
So hopefully that's not coming for any of y'all because that was weird. Now I don't care. But then I was like, what?
I already have gray hair underneath all of this blue.
It's so interesting.
I get super excited every time I find one.
Yeah, Dr. Murlock Jackson and Dr. Ferguson are sort of my inspirations. I want to be like them and just sort of let myself go gray. Alrighty, so I'm gonna make sure the chat is up in case y'all need to ask questions. And I think I have the ring light, but I think I'm gonna do a side light too because it's gonna rain. And so I don't know if I've ever sort of described to you my setup here. So our office is a loft. So over here, it's open to our great room. And this is like the darkest possible corner. It just happens to be where my desk is set up. So I have to really mess with lighting sometimes so that you can see me and I can see my notes. So, alrighty. So the trade approach. You know, we've referenced this already in a couple times, especially when we talked about the cultural psych stuff, right? But we're going to cover it in a lot more detail. This is one of the most influential approaches in American psychology. A lot of the assessments we talked about kind of rely on the trait approach. And again, that's not really a theory in some ways. So there's not like one central person. There's not like a Freud of trait approach. We'll certainly talk about some famous psychologists who have advocated for this and theorized about it and written about it. But it's not quite the same as some of the other things we have talked about and will talk about. Cheyenne, I'm so sorry. Yeah, everybody's got all kinds of junk going on. I know strep has been going around. Like one of my students got quarantined for strep because they thought it might be COVID. Yeah,
That's why I've missed so much class because I just keep getting sick. I've not been healthy since the semester started.
Yeah, like this thing is kicking my butt. So yesterday I was like, oh, I have all afternoon. I can get stuff done. And like Simba and I just took a nap. So
yeah, and I'm severely asthmatic and I have had bronchitis twice since the semester started.
I got bronchitis when I was younger and I hate it. I hate it.
I've been sick for like 3 weeks now too. It's awful.
It's so hard to kick when you're inside all the time, right? Because you're just sort of swimming in your own germs. Yeah, completely understand. Much sympathy, much empathy.
I also work with children, so I literally work in a petri dish.
Yep, exactly. Well, and I have one who brings that home to me every day. So I'm very glad her school is open, but it does mean we get all her germs. So I completely empathize. Although it is sort of interesting. I kind of joke that sometimes campus is like a preschool because there's the same amount of germs. There's the same amount of like people sneezing on their papers and then handing it to you. This is why more and more I'm moving to Blackboard for everything, even when I'm in person. I remember one time when I was getting ready to come back from my maternity leave, Quinn and I were shopping at Target. And when I shopped with her, even before she could talk, I would talk to her. And I was like, and mom's going to get the big thing of hand sanitizer because college students are very germy. And there's a Target employee stocking the shelves. And she just started laughing. but you all can't help it. You live in a petri dish, right? You can't get away from each other in the dorms. So, all right, I guess we should talk about trait theory, right? I'll dive into that. It's Friday. So trait theory is also sometimes called dispositional theory or attribution theory. So disposition is the qualities people carry around with them. The qualities people carry around with them. So these qualities sort of belong to them. They're somehow part of them. So you can think of it as, what are you disposed to do? The big part of this theory, no matter what you call it, is the idea of consistency and continuity, that you're going to act similar across different situations, and you're going to act similar across your lifespan because these are traits. These are things that are not going to change. So this kind of gives the idea of structure. That face, Miranda, so cute. Do you act the same in every situation? I mean, this is something to think about. You know, people are usually not the same and don't act the same in every situation, right? Oh, she got a bed. That's awesome. And I remember Professor Levine, when he was telling us about this, said, if you act the exact same way in every situation, you're actually probably seriously mentally ill, right? And this is not to be flippant. It's like you don't understand how to act appropriately in different situations. So the example I always give is, you know, let's say COVID's over and you can actually have parties on campus, right? And you walk into the party with your notebook and you sit down and you raise your hand and then start taking notes, right? Everyone's going to be like, are you okay? Do we need to like call someone? Have a drink. Maybe you're a little stressed out, right? Same thing on the flip side. If you come to class in person and you start dancing on the table, right? I might be like, you okay? Do you need to like take the day off from class, right? Or maybe you're really hyped about the lecture, in which case, awesome. But it would be, you know, not healthy to act exactly the same way in every situation, right? And that's not quite what this means. What we're looking at more is whether at the fundamental level, you're the same person regardless of the situation. So regardless of acting slightly differently in different situations, we tend to adjust our behavior to the situation, but act in accordance with our traits. So part of this is attribution. Part of this goes back to the fundamental attribution error, right, that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. It's thinking about why people do the things they do. And really, trait theory is one way to try to explain your own behavior, other people's behavior. And really, it's because people are naturally sort of social scientists. Honestly, we like to try to figure other people out. And behavior is often ambiguous, right? So we need to do a little more digging or theorize a little more to come up with explanations. So let's take an example, look at an example of what this might look like. So Halloween's coming up. I got a little reference to Casper the Friendly Ghost here. So if we think about the example of friendliness as a trait, right? That's definitely something that we tend to like in people. And so y'all can either unmute or stick in the chat. What sort of, what do we think about if we say someone is friendly? What comes to mind as things they would say, things they would do, things about them?
They're
We think they're
talkative.
nice people.
Talkative, nice, yeah.
They seem very approachable.
Yeah, approachable, definitely.
They probably smile frequently or have a pleasant look on their face frequently.
Definitely, which is harder to see now. Just
No RBF.
Yeah, no RBF. Or a couple of years ago, one of my classes came up with the male equivalent, which is resting dick face. So we got RBF and RDF.
That's great.
I like it. It's never left my mind, clearly. Acceptable, patient with others, open-minded and accepting, I'm seeing in the chat. Yeah, so generally a person we'd probably like to get to know and be around, right? So let's take each of these situations. And again, feel free to unmute or stick answers in the chat. At a party, what might a friendly person do? Ooh, and I like yours, positive and inspiring. Yeah.
Make sure that you're comfortable if you seem uncomfortable.
Yeah, they'd be kind of that mom.
Like check in on you.
They need anything?
They probably make other people feel accepted.
Yeah.
I would think, a friendly person at like a party, they're going to go around and talk to people and, really socialize with a lot of different people.
Yeah, they're the person who's like mingling. Yeah, Bianca said that in the chat.
Main thing that jumps to mind when I think of someone being nice to me at a party is like protecting me from like creepy people.
Yeah, looking out for other people. There's dancing. They might be the one in the middle of the dance floor, right? Or trying to get other people to come. So they're not only having fun, yeah, but they're also kind of looking out for everybody else, right? Again, a good person to know. How about what would this person do if they saw a stranger who was upset, just, somewhere on campus?
Stop and talk to them, ask them if they're okay.
Yeah, they say, are you all right?
Read the body language. If they look like they need to be left alone, just kind of nod to them and let them know you recognize them, but don't go up to them if they don't look like they want that.
Exactly. Yeah, and maybe they ask what's wrong. Carly, help them in any way possible. Macy's saying, try to help them. By Bianca, I like yours, trying to make them laugh, right? So yeah, they're gonna try to help them out, be supportive. Again, in a non-COVID world, what would they be like at a restaurant?
Kind to wait staff.
Yeah, kind of the wait staff. We always like those people, right?
Big tipper.
Yeah, big tipper, speaking good conversation. My father-in-law is like this, and he's forever like joking with the wait staff, and sometimes it's awkward, but he's dad jokes. Now I guess grandpa jokes, they kind of get a kick out of it sometimes, and I think they appreciate that he always like asks their name and remember it. Yeah, they might be the person that helps stack everything together, especially if they've worked as a server. Right? Those people are always good about making sure to make as little work as possible for the people who will come. How about walking through campus? So if you imagine walking from like V2 or now Allen Village to Greer, what would this person be like on that path?
So if somebody was trying to find one of their classes or something, you could like help them out, like give them.
Yeah, they'd be that person that like the visitor to campus is lost, like direct them,
Yeah.
right? Greeting people, smiling at others. I'm seeing, saying hello and smiling at everyone passing by, saying hi, smiling. Yeah. Then we've all seen these people right on that path. Like, hey, how's it going? Actually, one of the things I really enjoy about our campus is that path. My college campus had a path that actually ran a mile because it was a longer, more stretched out campus. And it was called Middle Path. And like, that was the main vein. Like that was the spine of the campus. You saw everybody there, right? And you were always like stopping to talk to people unless you were in a hurry to get to class. So it kind of has a vibe like that, right? Like I've often stopped between Batten and Clark to like talk to some people from the lighthouse or someone walking over to Batten. So yeah, that person would be very friendly, waving, saying hi. And what if they and their friend disagreed? How would a friendly person respond to that?
Trying to understand rather than confront.
Yeah, so try to be understanding, supportive of the friend.
Listens to them.
Yeah, that's a big one, right? So I'm going to mute so I can blow my nose. All right, so in the chat, we have acknowledging their opinion and not just shutting them down, talking it out peacefully. Yeah, so they're going to be respectful, trying to make things better, work it out, really listen to the other person. So now we've looked at these, 5 different scenarios, and the behavior is not identical, right? They're doing different things in each scenario. But if we use friendliness as the connections, for all those behaviors, we see we're really not so different, right? So this is the important thing, that a lot of critics of trait theory will try to argue like people don't act the same in every situation. And people who are support the idea of traits say that's not what they're about, right? It's not about the same behavior copy paste. It's about this trait, this underlying disposition guiding how you react to any given scenario. So there are two main points to keep in mind here. One is that this approach is based on empirical research, and this is really the hallmark of this approach. This is what they're very proud of in this approach. They really talk up the research. Most of the research, though, is correlational. It's a lot of what's called factor analysis, which is where you give people like a lot of, and we talked about this, we talked about assessment, but just a refresher, you give people lots of items, whether they be single words or sentences, and then you use a statistical method to see which of those group together. And basically, if you find that a bunch of those statements group together, then you can come up with a trait that describes those. And there's an emphasis on trying to measure traits as accurately as possible. So the idea here is, how do we measure friendliness, right? How do we get an accurate measure of that? And so it focuses on individual differences, right? So like friendliness is a variable that you could be really high on, or you could be really low on, right? We've all sort of met those people who are kind of low on the friendliness scale. And it doesn't necessarily make them a bad person, but it certainly means they would react very differently in those scenarios, right? So in terms of strengths, it assesses and attempts to understand how people differ. So that's good, right? It's not treating all people the same. It's recognizing there are differences. So that's a strength. But a weakness that people have pointed out is it does ignore aspects of personality that all people might have in common. So, okay, 6 of one, half dozen the other. And again, throughout this whole class, as I've pointed out, none of these theories we're talking about, not a single one is all encompassing. Not a single one can explain everything. So we got to take the good and the bad, and we've got to keep these criticisms in mind. So in terms of individual differences, here is a quote. Every man or woman, every person, let's say, include our non-binary identifying folks, is in certain respects like all other people, like some other people, and like no other people. So in other words, to break this down, if we go with A, like all other people, some properties and processes are universal, as I just acknowledged as a potential weakness of this, right? If we look at like some other people, right? So some people share things in common, some priorities differ, but it allows for grouping. And then like no other people, every individual is unique. So basically this fancy quote says, there are some things everybody has in common. There are some things we can group people based on, but really every individual is unique. And that's really a great overarching description of how we try to describe personality in general. But the trait approach focuses on B, basically. It focuses on that second level. The idea of how can we sort of group people by traits. And traits are the building blocks of personality, according to this approach. So as I mentioned, there's not like one overarching person, but we are going to talk about some influential psychologists who have been a big part of this approach. And one of these is Gordon Allport. And again, there's not a lot of theory in these theories, but he's the closest thing we get to a trait theorist. We'll see that trait theory usually involves using factor analysis, as I mentioned, and it's all about following the data. So if you remember when we talked about the MMPI, I mentioned how one of the developers was like proud that he'd never actually read all the items, right? It's like he didn't care, he just cared about the results. And so Allport is different because he is trying to put some theory behind it. And so he was an American experimental psychologist, and he was fascinated with the structure of personality. So he said people have predictable urges, predictable behaviors, predictable thoughts. And these characterize them. And so we could think about these as being parts of their characterize. And that character might be made up of traits. And so his definition of a trait is a generalized and focused neuropsychic system peculiar to the individual with the capacity to render many stimuli functionally equivalent and to initiate and guide consistent equivalent forms of adaptive and expressive behavior. Blah, 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 blah. This is how psychologists write, and I'm not always a fan of it. Like, we are too wordy sometimes, and it makes us unapproachable. Basically, this is saying what we've already said, right? That there are things that are unique to that individual that are going to guide them to do behaviors that are not identical, but are consistent with that guidance throughout different situations. So he's looking at the central trait or central dispositional construct or concept. And so we're thinking about habits, we're thinking about traits, we're thinking about types. And so what is a trait? Another psychologist who was very involved that we'll talk about later is Cattell. And Cattell defined a trait as a relatively permanent and broad reaction tendency. So a trait is essentially how we react to different situations. And so most of the time we think of traits, we think of them as a continuum, sort of like this bell curve here, that like you just sort of fall somewhere on there. But Cattell argued that there are types that people tend to like group into these different types, so little lumps instead of one big bell curve. We see a lot of people, you know, in a certain part of it. So like there would be a lot of people who were not that friendly. And then maybe fewer people who were sort of middle friendly. And then we have sort of this low lump of the golden, these are our nice, really friendly people, right? He said there are distinct clusters and sets and of people. And he said there's not an in-between. So he didn't think it was a continuum. However, in his same book, he defined a type, which is what he was calling these little lumps on the curve here, as a pattern of traits. So it is sort of circular logic. And again, this is where the not having theory does start to become really problematic, right? So he sees a trait as a characteristic. It's a place on the dimension. It's not the dimension itself. Again, this is not what everyone who does the trait approach believes, but this is one thought about it. More and more people are thinking of traits as continua, honestly. Another psychologist who's involved here is H.H. Kelly. And he's coming more from the cognitive perspective of thinking about people like computers, essentially. People were logical information processors. Take the information out, take the information in from the outside world, and then just sort of like spit out responses. He said there are three kinds of information. Consensus is, do all people respond this way to the same stimulus or the same situation? So consensus is, you know, does everyone respond the same way to it? So this is focusing on inter-individual differences. Consistency is, does the one individual, does that person act this way over time? So that's intra, within the individual consistency. And then distinctiveness. Does that person respond that way only to a particular stimulus or object or person? And so you're looking at cross-situational consistencies. And so what we're thinking, if we're thinking traits exist, dispositions exist, we're thinking that when we make attributions about why people are doing things, we can make them internal, that it's because of something within the person, this trait or type or whatever term they want to put on it, disposition, right? All means the same thing. And then stable is, this is going to continue over time across different situations. And so the way that we make those attributions, the way we determine if traits are a thing, is that we want low consensus. So people are going to act differently, right? People are not all going to respond exactly the same to every scenario. Because if they did, there would be no personality traits because we'd all just be the same, right? We want high consistency, just like with our friendliness example. We're going to act in similar ways based on that trait, based on that disposition in different scenarios. And then we want low distinctiveness, right? That they are going to be consistent across different situations. So personality is intended to capture consistency, stability, and individual differences. And that's really what the trait approach is focusing on. Do these traits allow us to see individual differences that are consistent and stable across different situations and across time? So one of the things that starts to get tricky is, how do we decide what is a trait? And then once we figure out a trait, how do we decide if that's actually a personality trait, right? Like, who gets to decide what's a trait and what's just like, people breathe, right? That's not a personality trait, right? So one of the ways we do this is a process and a concept called construct validity. And basically, honestly, this is the majority of what goes on in psychological research in this day and age, particularly in the area of personality, social psychology, clinical psychology, what have you. So it's the process of trying to get support for an idea about what a trait is. And in that process, we're trying to see is, can the trait predict what people will do in the future? So that's part of what we're doing when we're looking at traits is the trait a thing? And if we know about that thing, can it tell us what that person will do in the future? Can it tell us how they'll act at a party? Can it tell us how they'll act on campus, right? Can it tell us how they'll act if we put them in a therapy session? Right, so you start to see the applications of this. And this is really the essence of trait approach, dispositional approach, is the idea that the trait can predict what people will do in the future. And that's why we care, because as psychologists, we're trying to figure out how to predict both good things and bad things, right? So how can we help people feel better? How can we maybe even prevent them from feeling bad things in the future? And how can we try to prevent bad behavior, right? How can we try to seek out and shut down serial killers before they kill, right? Things along those lines. So a construct, just to bring us all the way back to the beginning of the semester, is an idea or a perception. And so in this case, it's put together by a theorist or a trait person, a trait psychologist. So what we are doing a lot of the times is looking at how we're measuring a trait. And it comes, and I have a diagram to show you this that we'll walk through. It kind of ends up being like circular, like we define a trait by how well we measure that trait, right? But how well we measure that trait is what allows us to decide if it is a trait. And it's really, the diagram will make it better, I promise. But basically, a measurement device, usually a questionnaire, but there can be other things like the ear or other things we've talked about, has construct validity to the extent to which that measurement device, that questionnaire, enables one to support predictions made on the basis of the theory in which that construct being measured is embedded. This is really abstract, so let me back us up and imagine this with a trait. So let's say the trait we're looking at is depression, right? This is an individual difference variable that obviously has clinical implications. So if we're measuring it and where our measuring device is good, we should be able to tell if that person is really depressed, and it should be allow us to predict whether or not that person will try to harm themselves, right? And that's one of the things we want to predict in therapy so that we can try to prevent it, either by coming up with things the client could do if they're feeling that way, or sometimes by making the radical step of involuntarily hospitalizing them until they're safe, right? So that's basically what we're doing here. So we're trying to see, can our measurement of this trait allow us to predict things that this person will do in the future? So one thing I should say about construct validity and reliability is I took a class in grad school that was almost an entire semester of just understanding these. So if you're like not fully into the delve of like all of this right now, that's okay, right? I just want you to get the basics of what we're trying to do in construct validity. So the problem with a construct, as we've talked about before, is that it's not directly observable, right? I can't just look at you and be like, that person would score this on the depression inventory, right? And that's probably a good thing. I've joked before with other classes that like, I don't just have like a scanner and I can't just scan a barcode on the back of your brain and see how much material you retained. And that's why I have to give tests, right? So we can't just observe it. And so it's only known by the network of laws in which we occurred. And this is called the nomological net. And if you remember, nomological refers to name. And so the nomological net is essentially all the things that contribute to the name of this concept and like that we can agree on that like a person who is depressed does X or feels X or says Y. Kernrock and Neal in 1995, this is like a seminal paper in psychology. If you go to grad school for anything clinical, social, personality, you will read this paper. They argue that the process of test validation is in principle open-ended. So you don't just like validate a questionnaire once and you're done, right? It consists of developing and evaluating a theory about what scores on a test actually mean. So again, predicting things in the future. In this sense, the process of construct validation is formally identical with trying to investigate and elaborate this nomological network in which the construct is embedded. So all of that on this slide means by examining whether or not a questionnaire has construct validity, we can determine if the trait it's trying to measure is actually a trait. So the way we figure out whether or not something is a trait is by seeing if the measure that we have created to measure that trait is predictive, right? Can tell us what that person will do. So here's the diagram that, again, I hope will make this more clear for y'all. So this is how we decide whether a trait measure works. And this will feel a lot like the scientific method we talked about early in the semester because it's based on that. So the idea here is that you have some sort of theory. And again, maybe we don't have theories about the idea of traits as a whole, but when you are coming up with measuring an individual trait, you do have a theory about it. You have assumptions about it. There are principles about it. There are constructs you think are related to it. And so you have predictions or hypotheses about, what will that predict, right? And these have to make sense, right? So if you're measuring anxiety, for example, it's not going to tell you anything about that person's intelligence, right? So it has to be things that actually make sense. And you also have to come up with a way to measure it. Are you going to do a questionnaire? Are you going to interview that person to try to get at their symptoms? Are you going to make behavioral observations? And if so, how are you going to codify those, right? And all of those things go into the research. So the methodology, so are we giving them the questionnaire? And if we are giving them a questionnaire, what else are we measuring, right? You can't just give like one questionnaire and be done, right? You have to see how things relate. So are we asking them about another trait? Are we asking them about behaviors they do? Things along those lines. And this is how we get to construct validity. So that, again, the reason we have to do this process is we can't just look at the person and be like, they score a 21 on the Beck depression inventory, therefore they're 21 depressed, right? It's not like we can look and be like, that person has brown hair, right? So this is how we have to get at measuring it, is in, again, not just creating the questionnaire, but does that questionnaire have meaningful prediction? Does it actually predict something in the future? So the construct is not that directly observable. It's known only by this process. And if we go back to what Kronbach and Meal said, you don't just do this once, right? This is cumulative. You do this over and over for maybe different outcomes, maybe different variations on how to measure the trait. And as you can see, these dotted lines, these feed back into, you know, if your methodology, if your research isn't quite coming up with what you want, yeah, maybe you have to go back and fix the theory, or maybe you have to go back and adjust your measurement. Maybe you're missing a piece of what that should be, or you created a questionnaire that doesn't actually measure what you were trying to measure, right? So this is the process by which a lot of psychological work is done. Even if the person isn't purposely setting out to like develop a questionnaire, right? Anytime you use a questionnaire that already exists, you do a little piece of this. And in fact, we have to include, when we publish, information about things like, you know, what is the reliability of this measure? How is it relating to other measures in the study or behaviors that the person's doing in the study? So a lot of psychology research is just adding to this. And even some of the research we'll talk about in a few weeks when we talk about behavioral genetics, because now you're still doing this process, but now the measurement's just different. Now you're measuring things, or maybe what you're predicting is different, right? So maybe you're giving them questionnaires, but then you're also looking at like, how does that relate to this gene, right? So I was actually a control subject for a large scale genetic study that looked at anorexia. And so I said, no, I've never had anorexia nervosa. I gave them my blood. And so they were trying to figure out which genes are actually related to having anorexia. So that's part of this process as well. So some of you might be looking at this going, Dr. Myers, why are you making us look at this crazy chart on a Friday? Who cares, right? I just want to go nap. I feel you. But here's why we measure trait. Here's the point. Again, traits predict behavior. Traits can be used to understand behavior. Why is that important? What do y'all think?
I know that organization or industrial and organizational psychology use it a lot to determine like who will be good at what jobs and who works better with people versus alone and things like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I've actually made some interactive activities for an intro psych textbook. And when we did traits, actually, I found a video where there was someone talking about using the Big Five now to actually do job prediction. So they used to use, and a lot of places still do use, the Myers-Briggs, which like is really problematic because it's not scientific. I could like rant about that for a while. And if you take assessment with me next fall, you will hear me rant about that for a while. I'm not going to do that here. But you know, something like the Big Five, you know, has a lot of science behind it. So maybe that could be helpful. So yeah, definitely something to think about with industrial organizational. I've mentioned the therapy example. Other examples are, you know, a lot of my own research. I'll give my own research as an example. I look at risk and protective factors for body image disturbance and eating disorders. And so by looking at these traits, the idea is that hopefully we can either come up with programs that would prevent this by capitalizing on the things that are protective, or by trying to eliminate or reduce the things that are risk factors. So the idea is it informs future behavior, it informs future programs. Educational psychologists, cognitive psychologists, for example, have come up with ways to help people study based on this. If any of you had Dr. Kinsey when he was here, he did a lot of this work. Dr. Ariel does some of this work. So yeah, it's, even if you're a basic scientist in psychology and you think like you're only ever living in your lab, right? Like your research is contributing to helping people in the long run, or animals, or whatever you're studying. I had a student a couple of years ago who did a really cool study with stingrays, for example, and their behavior. And we actually learned a lot from it. So that is a little intro to trait theory, or approach. We'll keep talking about this on Monday. Everybody have a good weekend, and I will see you all on Monday morning. And I'll do my typical sticking around just in case anyone needs to chat with me.
Have a good weekend, Dr. Maya.
And Megan, I know I owe you a letter of rec. It's on like #1 on my to-do list for today. So.
Okay, cool. I was just about to ask about that.
Yeah.
I also have an advisor's form that I need you to sign. Just saying that I'm planning on studying away, and where I found, or my #1 option has like options. So
email it to me?
Yes, I just sent it.
Okay, cool. Yep, I will just send those both in today.
Sweet, thank you so much.
Sorry, it's
have a good weekend. No, you're good. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Bye.
I have to ask this because my mom asked me this last night. Apparently on Jeopardy last night, like the last question was about like Mike Cannonball somebody and what theory like he had to do with, and it was like, I don't know, something about type A personality. And my mom was like, what the heck does a cannonball have to do with that?
It was probably just his weird nickname.
That's what I said, but like, I don't know. I didn't see it, but she kept just like, they kept emphasizing cannonball. And I'm like, I've never heard of that before, but I don't know. I told her I would ask you.
Yeah, I've never heard of it, but I'm looking. So say what the question was again.
It was something about like a personality theory that I think it was like Mike Cannonball somebody came up with.
Here we go. Physician Cannonball Mike Friedman. He came up with, it looks like, type A personality and type B. So he was a cardiologist and came up with it, which is really interesting. So he wasn't a psychologist. Came up with it.
All right. Well, I will tell her
And I
that.
learned something. So there we go.
Hi, Emily. All right, y'all. See you later.
Have a good weekend.
All right, sorry, my manager came in to grab a toolbox. I was looking at the days that are good for me for the makeup. I worked 10-hour days in a row this weekend.
Yes.
And so my next day off is Monday, but I would prefer to take it Wednesday if possible.
Okay, yep, we can do that. Shoot me an email about like when you think a time would be good for you to take it.
Okay, probably between 1 and 5.
Okay, 1 to 5. I'll just go ahead, and what I can do is I'll just open it for that amount of time and then just use the honor system that you only take an hour max to do it.
Hour max? Okay. I'll pick a time in there to do it for an hour.
Yeah, but just about everybody finished it in the 50 minutes this time around.
Okay. I'm pretty sure there's a way too where you can have it up for a certain amount of time, but only have it on a time limit.
You can, but it's like really complicated. So I just.
Okay. And then do you want me to turn in the take home portion at the time, like at the same time that I take this?
Because that'll help you study for doing this.
Okay. And then the interview paper as well. Am I good to have an extension on that?
Yeah, just upload it when you have it done.
I'm terribly sorry for all this.
It's Okay, yeah, I mean, I've been there. When I took this class in undergrad, I had to ask for an extension because I was so sick. And like, I had to take this trip, and my professor was like, well, you shouldn't take that trip if you're sick. And it's like, but I can't not. So I felt super guilty, and I got it done like before my extension. But it was actually really funny because it was one of those times I was really sick and I had bronchitis. And so I had a fever, and you could see like my take home essay grades went up as my fever broke. It's like the first one wasn't so hot. By the end, I was like getting A's on the individual essays.
Yeah, things are just really crazy, and this girl is getting antsy and ready to go. Where are you? There's your face. Please stop.
Cutie.
All right, time to go back to work.
All right, have a good weekend.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.